Okay, hi there. Welcome to another video looking this time at some strategies for getting top marks in evaluating government intervention in markets. I'm going to suggest for you in this video three main approaches to evaluate, maybe a fourth one, but essentially three, and they all start actually with the same letter, and the letter is E. So here are my suggested avenues for great evaluation in your A-level and IB economics papers. The first one is to ask, when it comes to intervention, to what extent is an intervention effective in achieving the set aims? In other words, does it work? I'll come back to some examples of that in a few minutes. The second approach is to ask the question, to what extent does an intervention lead to a more efficient allocation of scarce resources? Or does that lead to the risk of one or more government failures, making the inefficiencies worse than they were before? So the first two words, effectiveness, efficiency. And the third E is equitable or equity. The extent to which an intervention by the government leads to inequitable outcomes. So who are the winners? Who are the losers across different timeframes? And of course, it's perfectly possible to build a case for saying there may not be a case for intervention at all. Can the free market innovation machine find solutions to tricky problems? Some examples of interventions. I'm sure you'll study many of these ahead of your exams. The UK government is bringing in a new plastic packaging tax. That's going to be £200 per tonne of plastic by weight for things like bottles and bin liners and ready meal trays, etc. Plastic packaging used in farming and industrial processes. £200 per tonne, you can avoid the tax if the plastic used is more than 30% recycled. This is a tax on manufacturers who use plastic rather than the final consumers. But as we know, consumers often face higher prices. The government has brought in a carbon price floor as part of its emissions trading system, ETS. Set about £20 per tonne, I think, at the moment. The price of carbon actually is well above that, but the government was trying to prevent the carbon price falling to very low levels for environmental reasons. A few years ago, the government brought in the feed-in tariff scheme, which was effectively a direct subsidy to consumers, including households shown, filling their roof with solar panels. They were paid a set amount per kilowatt hour that they generated, and also used themselves, and also a smaller amount for any surplus energy that they created, which they re-exported back to the grid, hence feed-in tariffs. And minimum wage, of course, rarely out of the headlines. The UK minimum wage, sometimes called the national living wage, by people who don't understand what a living wage is. But anyway, the minimum wage is going to go up from £8.91 per hour to £9.50 per hour for adult workers on the 1st of April 2022. Okay, so for the highest level in evaluation, you need to support your evaluative comments with relevant chains of reasoning. And the chains of reasoning involve explaining the link in detail, sequentially, between cause and effect. We have lots of videos on the YouTube channel of examples. We have little walkthrough videos walking you through chains of reasoning on key topics. So do search them out. They're some absolute crackers. Okay, here are my three approaches to evaluation. First of all, is an intervention effective? That means, does it meet its aims? Does it work? Well, an obvious approach is to use the concept of elasticity. Consider the likely coefficient, for example, of price elasticity of demand. If you put a tax on high-fat foods, for example, will consumers reduce their demand? Depends on the elasticity, doesn't it? Consider the coefficient of cross-price elasticity. If you increase the tax on plastic packaging, will manufacturers switch to recycled plastic? Okay, that would be cross-price elasticity. Consider the likely coefficient of price elasticity of supply. Many students missed this out. So let's say the demand for plastic recycled products goes up, or products made using recycled plastic. But does that industry in the UK and other countries have the capacity, the supply capacity, to be able to meet the increase in demand? Elasticity of supply. Has the intervention changed the price enough to trigger a change in behaviour? Is it only going to have a marginal effect on prices, relative prices, or do you need a big change in price to trigger a response? And crucially, if you challenge the effectiveness of something, automatically, I think, you're inviting the introduction of some discussion, evaluative discussion on alternatives. Are there better alternatives? Is carbon trading a better alternative to carbon taxes? Or are carbon taxes better or worse than emission standards for vehicles and things? So once you challenge the idea of effectiveness, you're really thinking about alternatives, which is good evaluation. My second avenue is an intervention efficient. Does an intervention by the government lead to a more efficient allocation of scarce resources, or does it risk causing government failure? So allocative efficiency, for example, does an intervention bring prices down relative to cost? If you might intervene, for example, to cap prices by a monopolist. The job furlough scheme was quite interesting. Yes, it protected millions of jobs, but did it keep people in some jobs that might otherwise have moved to other jobs during the pandemic as the economy has changed? Social efficiency, does the intervention get you towards that social optimum where marginal social cost meets marginal social benefit? Does the intervention have an impact on economies of scale for good or bad? And does the intervention impact on dynamic efficiency? Does it drive faster innovation and knowledge spillovers, or does it have a negative effect on that? Clearly, once you challenge the idea that the intervention will automatically lead to more efficiency, you're inviting a discussion about government failure. And that can come in several guises. Now, government failure is when intervention, perfectly well-intentioned, to correct one or more market failures leads to a deeper, greater net social welfare loss. In other words, you make things worse. And it's also defined as when the costs of intervention to correct a market failure, the costs exceed the benefits. Again, so you make things worse. And government failure can happen if a policy decision fails to create enough of an incentive to truly change the behaviour and the decisions of agents to meet the aims of policy. Now, we have separate video on government failure, so I really strongly suggest you Google Julie Chu government failure on YouTube. You'll find a terrific video with lots of examples. But government failure can happen in all kinds of different ways. Policy can be set and influenced by well-funded lobbying groups. Governments searching for short-term quick fixes may suffer from policy myopia. The regulators appointed to act on the government's behalf may be captured by, again, lobbied, well-funded corporations. The government might introduce a policy without doing a cost-benefit analysis. That can be a cause of government failure. Or the policy might have very high enforcement and compliance costs, or conflict with other objectives of policy. So do take a few minutes, if you get a chance, after this video, to go back to the YouTube and look at our video on government failure. That should give you some great examples. The third avenue is an intervention equitable? Is it fair? So they assess the extent to which intervention leads to unfair, inequitable outcomes. Who are the winners? Who are the losers across different timeframes? So if you put a tax on high-fat foods, for example, if you put a tax on sugar or salt or plastic packaging, ultimately, the people who might bear the cost of that will be the final consumers. And often, the people who bear the heaviest burden are the lower income families, especially if the cost of living goes up. So pollution taxes might be regressive. If you're subsidising renewable energy with solar panels and things, well, who can afford solar panels? Who are the main beneficiaries? Is it farmers? Is it wealthier households? Who are the winners and who are the losers from subsidies? And if you lift the minimum wage, okay, that's going to have an effect across the economy, but there's going to be a differential impact across industries, across ages, sexes, regions. So, there are winners and losers to different degrees of any single intervention. Two points I think are really quite important. The government may choose to compensate some of those who lose out. And I think critically, whenever you get a question on taxation, sugar tax, a high-fat food tax, whatever it is, a plastic tax, congestion charge, etc., a lot does depend on how the extra tax revenues are used, for example. I think the tax on high salt foods, for example, could be used to raise money to fund school sports or Sure Start programs, etc. A really good approach as part of your evaluation is to challenge assumptions. So what do we mean by that? Well, that means questioning the validity and the applicability of the assumptions that underpin the theory that you've used in your analysis. So you might challenge the idea that consumers will always try to maximise utility, or challenge the idea of profit maximising firms, particularly the idea that they're going to employ fewer people if the minimum wage goes up. Professor David Card, Nobel Prize winner, brilliant economist, the work of Card and Kruger sadly the late great Alan Kruger, challenged the assumption that firms necessarily employ fewer people when the minimum wage goes up, particularly if they're monopoly employers. Now, this can be very high-level evaluation to challenge successfully the assumptions of a bit of theory. The key point from this video, please, there are many different ways to evaluate, and your examiners, for your exam board, they're not looking for everyone to evaluate in the same way. Finally, are there some absolute crackers, some examples of awesome evaluation phrases? Well, let me give you a few. Here's I don't know, 8 to have a go at. In theory, but in practice. So in theory, this theory suggests X, but in practice, the evidence suggests something different. So making that distinction between the theory and the textbooks and the applied evidence is a cracking evaluation approach. There's always at least one unintended consequence of an intervention like that, particularly that links into government failure. It's important to judge the impact of a policy on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so rent controls might work in one country, but less so in another. It might be more effective to nationalise the water industry than it might be to nationalise the postal service sector. Judge policies on a case-by-case basis rather than kind of sweeping generalisations. I love the fourth one there, the most persuasive, compelling argument is, whatever it is, because. That's often a great way to finish an essay when you're concluding, coming to your final comment. The standard analysis of policy X rests on assumptions that can be challenged, as we just talked about. To meet the aim of X, a range of interventions are needed. Again, a nice way to end an essay, particularly if you bring in maybe another intervention, an alternative that you haven't yet covered. There are different schools of thought on this issue. Yeah, so you might be able to come to a question or policy from different perspectives. Free market economists, for example, versus Keynesian economists making the argument for government intervention. And the last point, in the long run, although there's a risk of government failure, the risk of policy inaction might be even higher, greater. In other words, although yes, government failure can happen, if you don't do something, if you're inactive, if you suffer from policy inertia, the problem could get a lot worse. And I think climate change policies might well come under that category. There we go. So that was a little video on evaluation. Quick reminder in the spring of 2022 that we're running our super popular, superb revision courses at some of the world's great cinemas in the UK. We have a spring tour. The economics team is really looking forward to getting out and meeting hundreds and thousands of students, really zooming in on focusing on exam technique. It's part of what's called our Grade Booster courses, and details are on the TutorTube website. Okay, well, huge thanks for joining in on this video on evaluating government intervention. Stay safe, stay curious, and see you again sometime soon.